I'm Phyllis Jackson. Thanks for joining us for Stay at Home Connect.
Atlanta Public Schools kick off the school year virtually after delaying the start date by a couple of weeks. There is a new webpage set up with information on family resources and technology support, and the district will continue providing meals to students. Rockdale, Hall, Carroll, and Meriwether also began welcoming students back virtually. Meriwether providing an option for both in-person and online learning. Georgia Tech reports dozens of coronavirus cases. The website indicates that the students live on campus and are either returning home to isolate or moving to isolation housing, which is being provided by Georgia Tech. And those who may have come in contact with the students are being notified. A portion of those cases are connected to a fraternity house. In a statement to students, faculty, and the staff, University of Alabama President Dr. Stuart Bell says there is an unacceptable rise of COVID-19 cases on campus. He says, quote, "The trend is a real threat to our ability to complete the semester on campus," end quote. The school resumed classes August 19th. And despite re-entry testing, isolation, quarantining, and sanitation protocols, the school is still seeing the challenge of rising cases. The president says that violations of health and safety protocols, both on and off campus, will lead to disciplinary action, which could include suspension. Dr. Bell says although the goal is to complete the fall semester, the margin for error is shrinking. The coronavirus pandemic leads Airbnb to implement a global ban on parties and events indefinitely.
With restaurants and bars closed in many places, some guests are using Airbnbs for unplanned events. When this happens, it can put you at risk. It damages our relationship with your neighborhoods and local communities, and it's even more disheartening during a global pandemic.
Occupancy will now be capped at 16 people. Company representatives say certain countries, including the United States, have added an additional restriction. No one under the age of 25 will be allowed to book a house on Airbnb. Violations will lead to legal action. Officials say the move is in the best interest of public health. Just weeks away from its regular season opener, the NFL is hit with a setback after COVID-19 testing results in 77 false positives. The results are impacting several teams, including the Pittsburgh Steelers and the Minnesota Vikings. 5 nationwide labs are overseeing testing for the league, with one lab out of New Jersey reporting the false negatives. Recent tests confirmed 4 positive results from players at training camps. Those with questionable results are being retested. Atlanta City Council members Andre Dickens and Andrea Boone host a back-to-school bash at the C.T. Martin Recreation Center. Kids received needed backpacks and school supplies for the new year.
We're not going to let the coronavirus stop us because these kids still need backpacks and they need to be educated. So we're excited seeing families get what they need at this time.
That's going to do it for Stay at Home Connect. Have a safe evening.
Yeah, so today, Councilmember Boone and I are here at the great C.T. Martin Recreation Center giving away backpacks that are stuffed with school supplies for those kids in need around this community. It's back to school time. Each year we do a big back to school bash here. Well, we're not going to let the coronavirus stop us because these kids still need backpacks and they need to be educated. So we're excited seeing families get what they need at this time. Usually we do this event inside. People can come and pick out their backpacks, but we're trying to maintain social distance and to be safe. You see we're all wearing masks and we're putting them in their trunk or in their back seat so that we're contactless, and we want to make sure we stay safe and keep the kids and the family safe. So we're doing it outside.
Can one girl in a small town, an architect in a major city, and a suburban high school coach shape the future of the United States? Yes, they can. Because every 10 years, the census gives us that power. You can shape your future by responding to the 2020 census. Where do we need new roads to make our lives easier? Where will new school programs help our children thrive? Where could a new health clinic benefit neighborhoods? The 2020 census will inform these decisions and shape how billions of dollars will be distributed to communities like yours each year. And in 2020, you can respond to the census online, by phone, or by mail. It's easy, safe, and important. Make sure you and everyone you know is counted. Now is the time for you to get involved. Your community needs you. Together, we can educate and excite, inspire, and make sure every voice is heard. Together, we can shape our future.
I'm Phyllis Jackson. Thanks for joining us for Stay at Home Connect.
The federal government officially declares teachers as essential workers, saying the designation simply provides guidance and is voluntary. However, it calls on educators to return to the classroom even after possible exposure to coronavirus, as long as they remain asymptomatic. The state of Virginia is using a new technology in the hopes of containing coronavirus.
Virginia is proud to launch a new digital app called COVID Wise, COVIDWISE, that will be able to send you alerts if you've been in close contact with someone who tests positive. This app, COVID Wise, does not, I'm going to repeat that, does not track or store your personal information. It does not track you at all. It doesn't rely on GPS or your personal information. And while we want everyone to download it, it is voluntary. Instead, it uses the Apple-Google Bluetooth low-energy technology, which assigns random keys to positive cases. It uses those keys to determine if you've been in close contact with someone who tests positive for the COVID-19 virus and send you an alert.
AMC theaters open with 15-cent movie tickets and a Safe and Clean initiative.
We thoroughly enhanced our cleaning procedures and upgraded to HEPA filter vacuums and MERV 13 air filters. New electrostatic disinfectant sprayers are used in auditoriums before each showtime. All auditorium capacities are reduced to allow for social distancing. Masks are still required in the auditorium unless you're enjoying food or drinks.
Atlanta City Council member Carla Smith will join with officials from Invest Atlanta for the Summerhill Small Business Lending webinar later this month. If you are a Summerhill business owner, you will need to register. You can go to investatlanta.com and click on the Events tab for more.
Well, that's a wrap for Stay at Home Connect. Have a great night.
Hello? Hello? Yes, here. Okay, good afternoon, Councilmember. Councilmember Shepherd had some technical difficulties, so she'll be on the line shortly. Okay, well, I'm here.
Hello?
Hello, Smith and Lindo are here.
Okay, I'm sorry. I was on hold. I don't know what happened, but I was on hold. But thank you all for unmuting me. So we just have Smith.
Here.
And Jennifer Eyes. Brown. Okay. Do we have Jacob? Lindo, do you know if Jacob is on the call?
I'm confirming that Madam Chair should be calling in. Okay.
Yes, I'm here, Councilmember.
Okay. And did you bring any other of your staff folks, anybody else with you?
Yes, we should have several different folks from the mayor's office as well as police department and law.
Okay. All right, we're going to give it a couple more minutes and then we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm hoping that we will have more than a few on this work session.
Hello, Madam Chair. Michael Bond is present.
Thank you, Mr. Bond. Okay. Why don't we just go ahead and get started? Can we just ask the people who are on the line to just go ahead and introduce themselves, and then we can go ahead and get started? I think I heard from Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond is there. Is that correct?
Yes, ma'am. This is Councilman Michael J. Bond, Post 1 at Large.
All right. I just got a text from Mr. Westmoreland that he's online. I believe we have Ms. Jennifer Ides, who's online. We have Mr. Brown and Ms. Carla Smith. Are there any other folks, council members, who've called in since then? So we're going to go ahead and get started. Just in terms of housekeeping, if you all need to ask a question, can you text me or Ms. Lindo, if y'all don't have Ms. Lindo's number, or we can go through our group text. We can actually go through our group text also. Just text me, and I will recognize you. So thank you all for coming. This work session today is very important to me, and I think the council as a whole and the city, is that, of course, we know that over the last several months we've had a series of things that have happened with policing, not only in the city of Atlanta, but across the country in terms of Black Lives Matter and other things that are happening. And unfortunately, we had some unfortunate incidents in the city of Atlanta that caused a huge cry out in terms of police reform. So through that process, the mayor's office convened a use of force advisory council, and they have been doing their work for the last several months. And the report is out, It was conducted by the mayor's office, Mr. Jacob T. I'm going to call him T because I always mess up his name. But he's done a great job of leading this particular initiative. And today we will have a work session on the findings of this advisory council and to begin to ask questions in terms of what are our next steps, where are we going, because this is just the beginning. This is not the end. This is just the beginning of a recommendation. And so we'll be asking questions as we go along. And so I want to make sure it was available, a work session could be available to all council members. He's presented to our Public Safety Committee, but I want to have an opportunity for all council members who are on the Public Safety Committee to actually give input also. So to that point, he is available to us, so Mr. Jacob T. He's the program manager for this project. We have also Jerome Jordan, Deputy Chief of Staff. And then we have Darian, Darian from the APD. Darian, can you pronounce your last name? I'm horrible on names.
That's quite all right, Madam Chairperson. It's Shearbaum.
Shearbaum. He's
yes,
with the
ma'am.
APD. And we also have Maria Ross, project managers for the Mayor's Office of Innovations and Performance. So those are our staff folks, along with, of course, Ms. Lindo is also here to support us. So with that, Jacob, I would like to go ahead and get us started. And so go ahead.
All right. Glad to go ahead and get started. I just want to confirm, do we want to start with the presentation or public comment, or happy to go whatever direction?
We do have public comment. Thank you, Jacob. And so I'm also seeing something for someone. Oh, Andre, you're on. So, Andre, you're on the call. So, Andre Dickens, thank you. So, Ms. Lindo, let's start with the public comments. Thank you.
Yes, Madam Chair. Just one moment.
Hello, this is Brock Hanson. I'm a citizen of DeKalb County. Thanks for your time today. I wanted to just voice my support for continuing to reimagine policing, especially here in our great city. I think the whole nation is feeling the hurt of continued abuse of power, and I believe in this group in truly bringing the full extent of your humanity to everything you oversee. I think things like banning chokeholds, requiring de-escalation, requiring warning before shooting should go without saying in any policing situation, but we have to fight for it. And I really hope that you guys are fighting for it every day, and you feel the empathy that we feel when we see people getting shot on camera, and when we see these obvious abuses of power happening all over our country. And it's sad that this is one of those things that it's not. I hope that never happens again. When is this going to happen again? And we just hold our breath opening. It's not sooner than later, and so we have to keep pushing. And I thank you for your work, and please keep reimagining. And with each decision, just feel the empathy of these people that are lost a family member. We should all feel like we lost someone, because these are citizens, and life is equal across the board. So they shouldn't be like losing a loved one to ourselves. It's a very emotional and impactful thing. I thank you for your efforts, and please just use the full extent of your humanity when it comes to these situations that you're overseeing, and put yourself in the shoes of the one who has the gun pointed at them, or the one who's getting pulled over. Why do we have to be nervous when they're pulled over by police officers? It's unfortunate, but I believe that you guys can make a difference. So please keep fighting. Thank you for your time. Bye.
Hi, my name is Hannah McGugan. I am a 12-year resident of the city of Atlanta. I'm calling in support of the council adopting the 8 Can't Wait and the Next is 6. You say you still have good cops, but you need to let your good cops shine, and part of that is doing the 8 Can't Wait and Next is 6. My biggest, the thing that most resonates with me personally is the beauty of the intervening. The fact that police officers can be punished for intervening in bad cops. That makes me sick to my stomach personally. If you say you have good cops, let them shine. Adopt these principles of A Can't Wait and Mix the Six. Thank you very much. Please support the City of Atlanta and Black Lives Matter.
Is that it, Ms. Windows?
Yes, Madam Chair. We have 2 comments. Yes.
All right. We also have Mr. Reed from the Atlanta Citizens Review Board. He's trying to get in. He's on hold and he's listening to music. He's asked if he could get in, Ms. Window.
Yes, Madam Chair.
All right. We'll now start with Jacob. Mr. Jacob.
All right. Thank you very much, Councilmember Shepherd. And thank you, everybody. My name is Jacob Zegaibe. I'm in the Mayor's Office, Senior Policy Advisor, and I've been the Mayor's Office lead for the Use of Force Advisory Council that we've been working on since early June. Today I'll be presenting a presentation, which I hope is up on the screen. But this presentation is just an overview of the 45-day report and the process that we've been going through for the past 8 or so weeks, and just providing at a high level. As we walk through this, happy to take questions as well as at the end. This presentation does not walk through the 80-page report that has a lot of detail around every recommendation. So my hope is, as we engage in dialogue and questions, we can also have that report close by and speak to specifics that are there. So on to page 2 of the presentation. Let me first begin by saying thank you. Thank you to Mayor Bottoms for kicking off this effort and picking up the challenge that President Obama put out to have cities reevaluate their use of force policies, to stand up task force or advisory councils like we have. Second, thank you to the 27 advisory council members who were part of this. I'll talk a little bit more about the time commitment and how much work was done over a very short period of time. But none of that would have been possible without a lot of time that was dedicated by these individuals. Everybody was a volunteer. Everybody who did this was asked to do it, and they did it without asking for anything in return, aside from listening to them and helping put their thoughts together. So thank you so much to the Advisory Council and all your feedback. As well as the staff. So on the right side of this page, you'll see some of the City of Atlanta staff that was a part of it and our partners. There was a big team from the Mayor's Office as well as other departments to help support this effort. And, as we walk through it, I think you'll see just how much ground was covered in a very short period of time, and that wouldn't have been possible without all the resourcing that was brought forth, as well as our partners, the Boston Consulting Group, as well as Bright House, who really helped us look further and pull together information nationally or elsewhere and analyze data as we try to move through this entire report over a 6-week period. So on page 3, what you can see is a bit around the process. So on June 10th, the Advisory Council kicked off. The way that it was structured, Mayor Bottoms requested 2 sets of recommendations or 2 sets of findings. First, after 14 days, an initial set of findings, and then our 45-day report. The rationale was Mayor Bottoms, wanted us to move urgently. Didn't want this to be a 1-year advisory council that spent 4 to 6 months getting up to speed, because there is a lot to understand. And the idea was that very quickly there are some recommendations that could come forth that we could begin to move on. The second piece is this was also always meant to be one side of the picture, right? So all 27 members are members of the community, of the Atlanta community, and provide that perspective. There's one member from law enforcement, but as you may have noticed, there were no members of the Atlanta Police Department, and that was thoughtful in the design to say, let's bring forth a perspective, a community-driven perspective as to what we could think about, and let's do it as quickly as possible. So after 14 days, 10 recommendations were provided to the mayor, and within 24 hours, she issued administrative orders to move forward with a portion of those recommendations. And then on July 24th, the 45-day report that we'll talk through today was provided to Mayor Bottoms, and shortly thereafter, the mayor published the report, as well as putting out several administrative orders to take initial actions. And these initial actions take steps towards 16 of the 33 recommendations, and those are just initial steps, and I'll talk a little bit about that. Just lastly, how did we work? As I mentioned, it was a lot of work, it was a lot of time. a lot of meetings, but the way that it was structured was weekly at least, and sometimes we had 2 a week. There were weekly advisory council meetings. In between those advisory council meetings, there were weekly focus group meetings, and there were 5 different focus groups that we looked at. I'll talk a little bit more about that. But they spent time in between going further and digging deep. There was this idea that there's a lot to understand around use of force, and we divided the group up to spend time on little components and brought it all back together for the final report. We also spent time with doing expert interviews. So that was members of the community, that was members of law enforcement, that was people in other cities. A lot of different feedback came towards getting these recommendations. And then lastly, we tried to pull best practices, and you'll see that in the report. When recommendations were made, the aim that we spoke with the council was never make them in the air, to always tie them to an example or something that was going on elsewhere. And you'll see that throughout the report with each of the recommendations. So now I'll go to page 4 and talk a little bit more about how these recommendations are structured. And, as y'all know, this was a use of force advisory council. So a lot of things could have been discussed, but given the time and the scope, we try to keep it very specific and germane to items that relate directly or closely to use of force. And ultimately, the framework that the group came up with here on page 4 is that what we want to make sure in the end is that we have an aligned purpose for the Atlanta Police Department with the community, and that we have a shared vision and looking at where we're going. And there were 5 building blocks that they looked at under purpose, and purpose was not something they tried to figure out on their own. It was said that's kind of the point that we're all trying to drive towards, and I'll talk more about how we get there. But the 5 topic areas were vision, mission, and values. And the idea there being that those are the underlying pieces that drive culture within a department. So as we talk about having a department a police department that has the culture that the community believes in, that the department believes in, that we're all aligned, the vision, mission, and values are the starting point to that. The second area was standard operating procedures. So as people talk about 8 that can't wait or talk about the specific SOPs within APD, there was a group that focused on that. The third area was governance. And specifically within governance, a lot of the focus was on the Atlanta Citizen Review Board and how that relationship of independence through the review board with APD and our Office of Professional Standards, OPS, interacts. The fourth area was community partnerships. And this area focused a lot on those entities that are not directly within the city of Atlanta, but can play a fundamentally important role within public safety and moving us, towards the collective vision of the community we want to be. And folks like Atlanta and Fulton County Pre-Arrest Diversion, at Promise Youth Centers are all part of this group, and I'll talk more about what those recommendations mean. And then finally, reporting and transparency. So all of this is only possible if there is trust, and in order for there to be trust, we have to be as transparent as possible. And I think, APD does a great job of putting information out, and this was a lot about what are the next steps and who's doing it the best around the country, and how can we push to aspire to be, the best when it comes to that. So that's the structure of the report, and all of the report flows out of those 5 focus areas. What I'll do now is talk through the recommendations at a high level. And what I won't do is talk through every single one of the 33, but I'll talk through every focus area and give a little bit of the essence of what is there. So now on to page 5, first starting with vision, mission, and values. So one subgroup of the advisory council focused on this for several weeks and came out with 4 recommendations specifically. The first being around convening a working group or a group to think specifically about reimagining the vision, mission, and core values of the department. The idea there is that whatever that working group is, it would need to be community and APD together, coming and finding a shared, vision for the department as we move forward. The second thing that they did is they also realized that they couldn't create the vision, mission, and values, right? Though they are community members and represent the community, you need more people at the table. You need APD at the table. So what they did is they spent the time, and you'll see it in the report, really thinking about what are some core principles that they believe should drive a process like that. And they came up with 7 guiding principles that they recommended should be prioritized as an effort to move forward to look at that. So there were 2 additional recommendations. I won't go through every one, but that's just kind of what vision, mission, and values was about. The second thing you'll see on the page is these green dots. And what the dots mean, if you see an initiative with a dot next to it, it means that it was captured as part of an administrative order that the mayor put out upon releasing the report. So that means that we're starting to move or look towards next steps on that recommendation. If you don't see a green dot next to one, it doesn't mean that it's not important. It doesn't mean it's not something that we may want to do. It just means that in that first initial push, it wasn't included. And as we said, this is only a first step. So that's the vision, mission, values group, and thinking about the culture of the department. The second group was standard operating procedures, and a lot of what they looked into were around the specific procedures that relate to how an officer engages with the community, specifically around requiring de-escalation, strengthening our use of force continuum, further restricting deadly force. And I want to be clear here in saying that all of these are elements that APD had in place, and a lot of the recommendations are looking at how do you go maybe a little bit further, and looking at what other cities have done to do so. And they lay out various examples of what that looks like. The last one you'll see at the bottom is add peer duty to intervene and complementary non-retaliation reporting requirements. So, a duty to intercede was something that was already a part of the culture of APD, but it may not have been as explicit, and carving that out very explicitly and putting training behind it and really moving it forward has been something that has come out and actually is something that APD is already moving on. I was at a training on Friday where they were already moving with senior leadership staff to make sure that flows through the organization. So that group of recommendations really focuses on those policies, and there were several there. Next, I'll go to page 6 and talk about governance. So on the left side, you'll see there were several recommendations on governance, and the way that I speak through these is there were 3 types of groups. The first group was around really the oversight or the governance of the organization of ACRB. So how do they balance with APD, and what level of oversight and influence do they have? The second group was around what I would call working processes, right? So the exchange of information, the timelines that things are done on, how do they work with APD? And everybody often wants to focus on how much power or how much influence somebody has, but often when investigations go on, a lot of the most important things are how do we exchange information, what do we exchange, when do we exchange it, so that we can get a timely verdict back to anybody who reports. And a lot of these recommendations focus on making sure we're always improving there and doing better, as the two organizations need to work in collaboration, but obviously in independence. And then the last piece was a lot around enabling ACRB to continue to flourish and grow and expand. So around budget, or around how do you raise community awareness. I think one of the things that Atlanta takes a lot of pride on is having a citizen review board, and other cities look at Atlanta as a leader there. However, when you ask the community, there are a lot of community members who don't even know it exists. And that is a challenge, and that is something that we need to overcome so that people know they have a third party that they can go to when they have grievances with the police. So a set of recommendations there, and you can see the ones that were highlighted in administrative orders. The fourth area is an interesting one, and we've talked quite a bit about this, community partnerships. And the way that I would characterize this best is today the answer to most things is 911 and APD. And our police officers get asked to do a lot. And you have a joint probably approach where the community is saying maybe there are certain things police officers aren't the right group to respond to. And you have police officers who are saying there are a lot of things we're asking them to do. And this actually looks at, are there certain items that we can look at differently so that we can always respond with the most capable and most trained group to it? And that may be the police by themselves, that may be the police with a partner, or that may be somebody other than the police. And that's what this group looked into, so establishing what we call a response continuum, who responds to what types of calls. Also, we have a number of partners that exist, so there's a second group of recommendations that we're looking at. How do you strengthen the partnerships we have and expand them? Pre-arrest diversion, I believe that Moki is on the line and will be able to speak some, but they're doing some exceptional things. They're in 2 zones now. We're looking at expanding that citywide, and they're even taking that further and trying to see if they can create, take requests via 311 so that there are certain calls that don't even have to go to 911. And we've got to make sure that we continue to strengthen that and expand that, because that's something we're hearing from the community. And then lastly, there are partners that we could have that we may not have today. And a bit of this looked at how do you start to build out a landscape of community partners that can be there to collaborate, because, you know, maybe somebody who's experiencing homelessness or experiencing, you know, addiction to drugs, the police aren't the right person long-term to fix that, yet they are often the person who's regularly responding to that. And we need more partners if we're really going to address the underlying, or begin to address some of the underlying issues there. So that's the community partnerships group, and then finally, reporting and transparency. This is, you know, in some ways, a lot of these recommendations are very nerdy, and they're in the weeds on the data and our systems and all that. But the whole idea being that we need to make sure that we have the data and systems in place so we can always be as transparent as possible, as well as we can use that data to drive decision making and getting better. So a number of the administrative orders that came out were saying, hey, we have documents that we developed that we need to always make sure are being made public, as well as you know, creating dashboards and things of that nature so that the public recognizes where we're at on use of force. And perhaps the best example I could use there is that, you know, every year we get 1 million calls to 911. You know, when you look at our police department, they arrest, you know, they make about 30,000 arrests a year. And then when you look at reportable use of force, you're really talking about 700 or less reportable uses of force instances. And then as you look at that, most of them are physical force, right? So it's really important to have that data out to the public so that we can have a strong dialogue around what is the magnitude of the issue, how are we trending, all of that. And that's a lot of the focus of these recommendations. So I just moved through 33 recommendations and 80 plus pages and 6 weeks of work very quickly, but hopefully that gives a bit of a taste of the set of recommendations. They're very comprehensive. It is a lot of work to get all of these done, and quite a bit to get any one, but they represent a really strong, you know, initial step and a very fast one, having been created in only 6 weeks by a group of community members with the support of the mayor's office and partners. I'll go to page 7, and I think this is just really important to state that these recommendations are only a starting point. This is a page straight out of the Advisory Council report, and I think they recognize that, you know, change not only is difficult, but it takes time, and it takes a lot of people being at the table. And, you know, these recommendations form a starting point. They form a great basis and a beginning of a roadmap for us to work together with our police department, with the community, to start to come together and bring about change that people are asking for, change that people are asking for in the community as well as in the department. But it is a first step. But even with that being a first step, I think what's really important and what maybe we could do better of is talking about the progress that is being made very quickly. So on to page 8. Over the summer, there's been a lot of discussion around, you know, policing, and a lot of work has gone in, and we don't always do such a great job of talking about the change that is occurring, and is occurring actually pretty quickly. So on the left side of the page, you know, we've taken a number of initial actions. Some are related to funding, some of them are related to bringing in the expertise and the input that we need to move forward, and then some of them are policy changes, you know, on the ground that are changing things. And I'll just walk through some of them because we do need to recognize them, and I think it's important that we are actively communicating. I even heard a public comment that may not have been accurate to where we're at today as we kicked off the meeting. So, you know, first, a number of budget changes were made in the last budget to strengthen the Atlanta Citizen Review Board and the work that Lee is leading, as well as the pre-arrest diversion program, so we could spread that all over the city. And those are two major milestones that are helping us you know, find other ways to work with our police department. Obviously, there was a shift of $13 million from corrections to constituent services. While that may not be police, that is part of our, you know, our public safety apparatus, and that is a movement in a direction that is very important to recognize. Under expertise and input, obviously the administrative order that we just discussed to create the Use of Force Advisory Council, but the mayor also put out an administrative order to bring on external support for policy review and community engagement. As I mentioned before, these changes are big, right? Every city around the country is talking about it. Atlanta's not by themselves. But the policy review and changes that we make to our SOPs are not, you know, New Jersey's doing this, drop it here, or, you know, Jacob and a few people can go and write up the new policy. There's a lot of laws, federal, state, local, that we need to be aware of, and we need that external expertise to help us work through that, because, you can't make SOP changes without a lot of thought in how we move forward in the legal framework that we operate in, as well as community engagement. One of the big things that is to come is a full community engagement effort around this, and that's going to be fundamentally important. We did community engagement with the advisory council. We had a town hall with more than 200 people attending, 300 people registering. We had a survey with more than 4,000 responses around the report, but there's got to be a lot more. And then lastly, the creation of an internal task force. So within APD, we stood up a group of individuals that represented all ranks, all zones, and worked to get further ideas and recommendations that the council didn't put out there, as well as they reviewed some of the council's recommendations and provided thoughts on them from where they sit. And that two-way dialogue is important, as well as that internal voice, because it's not, in the end, any changes impact the department, and they need to be aware and on board and understanding, and they have a very valuable perspective that we need to have. Lastly, policy changes. So what has really changed, this summer? So the mayor issued an administrative order directly following the death of Rayshard Brooks, and there were changes that were made to our SOPs following that. As of July 2020, there have been changes that address each of the APD Can't Wait policies. So, if you look at the latest SOPs that we have for APD, they are different than they were at the start of the year, and they address things like duty to intercede. Chokeholds have been banned for a long time, but each of those 8 have been addressed in our SOPs, and that is something that we should be celebrating. And I think there's probably a lot of miscommunication and misunderstanding around where we're at there. And then lastly, 2 administrative orders that adopt recommendations that have come out of these groups and we're working to implement. And those have been already done. Policies are changing. Like I said, I was at a training on Friday with top level leadership where we were working through duty to intervene, and they were presenting on the training that they're already developing and how they roll it out across the entire department and start to change culture. So really powerful, and I definitely want to give kudos to APD for the level of rapidness they've responded when these orders come out and when we're asking for changes. On to page 9, though, this is all a process, and I think that's really important. And the way that we've kind of framed it is we've established much of the what. We're now working through the how and the when. And as we do that, we come back to the what. And it's an ongoing process to improve and move forward. So the what is a lot around collecting ideas. That's the Use of Force Advisory Council, the report that you've seen, the internal task force, working with Police Foundation, getting community input from our partners directly from the community, and that helps shape the what. As we get more of these interventions that we want to do, we have to vet them, develop the plan. That is a lot of the how. And these administrative orders the mayor has rolled out are building a roadmap for a lot of the how, but there will be more. And this kind of helps us shape the ones that have been vetted, the ones that we know we have a clear legal line of sight into moving forward with. But ultimately, the when is going to be dictated by assigning the resources, by developing the full roadmap with timelines, and ensuring that change sticks. We always want a lot of change, but all these things take work, and sometimes they take resources, whether it be people or funding. And, we've got to be aware of that, and we've got to make sure that change is happening at a pace that we can absorb, because we can't change everything at once. We would love to, wake up tomorrow and everything be perfect, but change takes time, culture change takes time, and we've got to be thoughtful about how we move through that process. So I'll close out with 2 final sentiments that came out of the report that I think are fundamentally important as we think about the roadmap ahead. So on to page 10, one of the things that is really important in the report is it talks about 2 things: reform and reconciliation. And most of the report is about reform. It's recommendations on how we reform and we move forward. But at the end of the report, there's this discussion around reconciliation. The way that it's framed is engagement, or to engage, to envision, and to evolve. To engage the community and APD together, right? There's a lot of mistrust, there's a lot of lack of trust, misinformation, or information that isn't being passed both ways, and we have to engage, and that has to be a part of reconciliation, because there is a lot of pain in the community, there's a lot of history, and we have to get past that if we're going to get to the next step, which is envisioning where we want to be, and what we want the law enforcement to look like in Atlanta, before we can finally get to the step of evolving. But all of these have to move together, and this idea of reconciliation is extremely important when we talk about reform, because the two have to go hand in hand. Otherwise, you may have changed policies, but we still have a lot of challenges and underlying issues that we haven't gotten to. And then maybe I'd like to end on maybe a powerful and positive note on page 11. As we were working through this with the advisory council, we spent some time looking backwards as we were looking forwards, and you know, there was this really powerful message that came out that actually APD can do this, and we as a community can do this because we've done it before. And as you look back to the 1940s, you know, Atlanta, the city too busy to hate, yet we had a police force that was not integrated. And I mean, you know, what we're working on today is very difficult, but what they were dealing with back in the 40s and integrating the force, I mean, you can imagine for APD how difficult that would have been internally for the culture, for, you know, morale, for so many things, and they made it, right? In the 1970s under Mayor Maynard Jackson, there was a lot of growth, there was a lot of change. You had your first black police chief, and it was another evolution of the force. And given everything that's going on in the nation, that not just Atlanta seeing every city is, this is another evolution in the way that it's framed, in the belief that we've done it twice before, we can do it once more, but it's going to require everybody working together and coming up with a common vision. But the good news is we have a police force who has shown that they can change over time, and an experience that I've had working with them, that they've been very responsive and that they really do have the public good in mind. The question is, what does that look like? So I'll pause here. I'm sure there are lots of questions. I have the report open next to me as well, if there's any very specifics on the report. And I'll just say thank you and take any questions there may be.
Thank you, Jacob. So I want to recognize Ms. Overstreet. She's also joined us. Has any other council members joined that I didn't recognize? I know we have Ms. Overstreet, we have Ms. Smith, Ms. Ives, Mr. Dickens, Mr. Brown, Mr. Westmoreland, and Mr. Bond. Have I missed anyone else? Okay, thank you. Questions? Everybody is quiet. If you all have no questions, I'll jump in and begin to ask a couple of questions. Is there anyone who has questions?
Madam Chair, I'd like to ask a question.
Mr. Bond.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for the presentation. My first couple of questions is there a specific place where the public can access the report and the subsequent actions resulting from the report, any legislation or executive orders or any kind of anything that's happened since the activities in April began? Because one of the things I'm finding is that there have been a lot of people who attempted to follow this process, but of course,
Mr. Bond?
Done with the response.
Mr. Bond, you cut off for a moment. So at some point,
I was just saying, is there a place either on the city's website or on APD's website where the dedicated to the policy changes or any legislative changes that have been done since April?
Absolutely. So on the City of Atlanta website, there's a tab labeled Use of Force Advisory Council, and I can share that with Corinne and make sure that it gets to all council members. But it outlines every document, every press release, everything that's come out from the advisory council, and you know, you could see every meeting document, every bit. So that's comprehensive, everything that's gone on. Councilmember, I think your second question, and this is something that we're working on as we speak, is maybe a little bit more of a synthesized version that we can, you know, be putting out in a more accessible way that does outline everything that's occurred, because a lot has occurred, and we're working towards that. You know, we know that a website, you know, is really, really good for transparency, and it's all here. But often, you know, not everybody is trying to click on all the links and look at all the reports. So I think that's something that's in our court that we're working towards, to at least have an infographic or something very quick that people can look at and understand just how much has changed over the last few months regarding this topic.
Yes, that would be very helpful, and I think that your sensitivity that there are many members of the public who don't necessarily. We still have an internet divide in the city, and so if there is a flyer or some type of graphic that can be created that can outline the changes, I believe that would be helpful. Second, in the way of policy for the changes that may occur in APD in the coming months, do you foresee any legislation that the council would be considering as a result of the work of the task force?
Absolutely. So I'll begin to answer that question, and I don't know if Amber or Deputy Chief Shearbaum would like to chime in, but I think it's largely going to depend on what the policies are. So largely, to my understanding, thus far, I'm definitely not the best expert here, but most of the SOP changes that occur for APD are policy changes within the department. So they don't require per se legislation. So as far as it pertains to specific policies, I don't know of any, and I haven't seen any, but I could be missing something. I would welcome the team to chime in there. The second piece around, as we start to look at, the expansion of potentially pre-arrest diversion and other ones, there likely may be legislation related to that as we look at potential MOUs or just agreements that we'll need to push that further. So I just say I don't believe so because, policies will be under the mayor's office as an executive action. But as the partnerships go and we look at some of those changes, as well as maybe potential changes with ACRB, those may come to council. But please keep me honest here if anybody would like to add on there.
Hello? I think that's, I'm still here, but I think I know that you are correct. I just didn't anticipate there was something beyond what was in the executive sphere. My last question I'll ask, because I want to yield to many people on the call. In conversations and public comment and dialogue that I've heard from activists since the demonstrations that began in April is that a theme where APD might respond differently, or there may be additional, caseworkers or social workers. People have asked, shouldn't APD do that or defer calls to other agencies? And I know that there are a huge amount of problems associated with trying to discern from the 911 center what would be a call that, if someone's calling for help, that you could, shift to a social worker. And, of course, if that social worker shows up, they don't have the force of law behind them. So would the people even listen to the social workers? But is that something, or did the committee get to that level of analysis on how APD should respond to those type of calls, whether or not they should be partnered with other agencies to respond to calls, anything in that vein? Did they get down to that level of analysis? To some degree, absolutely. So in the community partnerships working group, that was a big focus, and I'll maybe answer that question a few ways. So first, one of the things that they did define was kind of the spectrum of response, and saying that we need to go further on it, which is APD alone response, APD with a partner, as you may have mentioned, let's just say a social worker, if that's the right example, and then non-APD at all. And I think depending on what the call is or what the response is, we just have to work harder to get very clear on who can respond to what. To your question around, as they respond, what abilities do they have? Maybe one of the misconceptions or things that folks may not be as aware of is, we do have a pre-arrest diversion program that is doing some great work, and I would love for Moki to perhaps chime in if she's on the line and just give a little bit more background there. But often when you have the partners responding, it's consent-based. So the individual who's being responded to must consent to any of the actions that are occurring. So it's just a different type of responder model, and I think it is very much in line with what a lot of people are talking about. But we haven't looked at any models or talked about anything where
people can respond and have the same type of authority as an officer because they're not officers, and I think that's exactly why we want them responding. So I said that to answer your question, saying we're working through it. It has been a point of discussion. It's discussed quite a bit in the report. And then lastly, Atlanta already has a model that is doing a lot of what people are asking for, and even they're speaking about potentially, being able to take calls via 311 where, there would be no police response. They would be the ones directly responding if it was that type of incident that they could be best adept to respond to, which would be a major shift in, I think, a lot of what people are asking for. Moki, do you happen to be on the line? And I don't know if there's anything you'd like to add.
Yeah, sure. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Great. Yes. So Moki here with Pre-Arrest Diversion. I appreciate that, Jacob. And I appreciate the question. I think it's I want to add a couple things. One is that in looking to sort of right-size the role of police in responding to this wider range of activities, I think how we've been thinking about it is there are items related to issues of community concern, homelessness, maybe behavioral health issues that are not crisis related, right? Where we really likely there's not a public safety threat. It's an issue of quality of life that may not necessitate a police response at all. And that's where we're building out a response, the ability to send a harm reduction team through 311. So in the same way that 311 currently receives complaints of potentially homeless encampments, for example, there would be the opportunity for people to use the non-emergency city services line to call in issues like that and have an alternative to police resources being deployed. That's one piece of the puzzle, and we think it's in some ways like it's the place to start because people will be self-selecting into that system, and because Pat already has relationships with the Atlanta Police Department. So if we needed to, we would be able to continue collaborating with APD and the officers in the zones. The other piece, though, I want to lift up is I think that the only way for a continuum of responses to work, and the only way for the 311 piece to work, is if we have, if we're really looking at building in co-response and alternative responders into the 911 system for crisis calls. And so that's something, I know did not get to be fully explored in this phase of the report, but I would really encourage the council members to look at that in terms of being able to, for 911 to be able to dispatch either a co-responder, like a clinician and an APD officer when appropriate, or alternative mental health crisis response teams. And so I just want to throw that in there as, that's going to be a major gap to this continuum of alternative responses, and I think it should be a priority.
Well, thank you for your response, and I also want to thank you all for your work with this committee, and if any of the citizens participated and listened, I want to thank them for their participation, but also encourage you all, if Fulton County Health is not involved, that they get involved. In my own experience in law enforcement, I've seen it both ways, particularly around mental health. You have some people who are really in need of intervention and crisis and care, and then you have the flip side of that where there might be a family member or a spouse or a related person who is simply just tired of the behavior of the person with mental illness concerns that definitely needs help, but is called and pulled away because someone called 911, and once they have the medication, they're fine, they're stabilized, but they're in jail. And so I would hope that we could get them involved in any future discussion. But thank you all for your responses and answering my questions. Madam Chair, I will yield to other members.
Thank you, Mr. Bond. Is there any other member who has questions?
I do, Councilmember Shepherd.
Who is I do, Councilmember Shepherd? Please state your name.
Overstreet and Brown,
Okay.
actually.
Was that Mr. Brown who said I do? Councilman?
Oh, yes, ma'am. I'm
Okay, so
sorry,
we'll go with-
Ms. Shepard.
We'll go with Mr. Brown first, and then we'll follow with Ms. Overstreet. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you to the entire committee for working to put together this recommendation and the entire task force that's come together to make this happen. I just have 4 questions. My first one is, we recently introduced passed legislation around alternative tooling to reduce the use of excessive force. And I was just curious, were there any findings in which we can implement through the recommendations of this report to address this major concern in the community?
Thank you, Councilmember. When you say alternative tooling, you're specifically you're speaking to the tools that are on the belt?
Correct. And just the tools that a lot of times, are utilized and sometimes result in the death of, unfortunately, unarmed people in the city.
Absolutely. So that was a point of discussion, particularly early on, and then I think what ended up happening is it flowed into SOP recommendations. So one of the things we looked at, was use of force, and particularly deadly use of force by APD over time. And as we looked at as you compared that to other cities, what you found was that, in instances of deadly use of force by APD, you're not seeing it via taser or a lot of other. It's almost exclusively in the data that we were looking at, firearm. So a lot of the discussion from the group flowed from that and saying, how do we look at that group and change that? And they went towards policies that focus more on interaction, whether it be de-escalation, or whether it be, use of deadly force, so getting to that step of deadly force. And that was the focus, and looking at what other cities are doing from a policy and training standpoint to look specifically at that. There wasn't a look at, disarming officers or removing the firearm. I know there are other items that have been spoken about, like bowler wrap and different things like that, but given that all the instances were firearm related, and there wasn't discussions around removing firearms from officers, it was exclusively discussed within the procedures and how officers engage.
Understood. Is that a conversation that we can continue to kind of work through? Just because I know it's a real concern and something that, as we continue to see, throughout the country, it's not just a concern, but it's impacting a lot of people's lives. I think, so if that's something we can continue to kind of have and work to reshape, I think that would be a really good direction for us to move into as a city. The other thing I wanted to ask is, what methods has the recommendations outlined in relation to rebuilding the trust between residents and local police? I heard you mention it earlier on the call. I met with Chief Bryant maybe about 2 weeks ago, 2.5 weeks ago, and he and I talked about community policing and how effective it is, but that there's also a capacity issue with APD given everything that's transpiring in the city. So I'm just curious, have there been any serious discussions around implementing a community policing force that can work either through a cycle and foot patrol to help better rebuild the relationships and reduce crime, in the city as a whole? We introduced one on MLK and Lowry under the direction of Chief Shields, and we had a huge amount of success. So I'm just curious of where that fits into the overall recommendations and how we can move into a place of action and actually have a force stood up, because we ran into quite a few issues around overtime and finding officers that were willing to commit to the community policing unit. So I think, Is that something that's been addressed? I would love to know what the next steps are, of how we could potentially move forward in implementing that within our current force.
Great question, council member, and I'd also love if Deputy Chief Shearbaum could pile on. For the Use of Force Advisory Council, you'll notice there isn't a recommendation around community policing. A lot more of the focus was on are there others that could work with the police force to respond in the community, as well as the policies. So, that was one of the challenges we had. There were so many things we were speaking through, and it was like, what can we connect most directly to use of force? It came up, but it didn't end up being one of the recommendations. But as we said, this is a starting point. That by no means means that the advisory council doesn't believe that's important, and it also doesn't mean that it may not be a good thing. It just wasn't part of the report. However, maybe Deputy Chief Shearbaum might be able to speak more to some of what the department's doing, or if there are any discussions already ongoing.
Certainly, Jacob. Good afternoon, Councilmember Brown, members of the committee. The police department certainly knows and has experienced that when our officers are outside of their patrol vehicles, not responding to 911 calls, but actually patrolling on foot, Segway, and bicycle, as we do along the Martin Luther King corridor, we develop those relationships with the community that we don't always get and we lose through 911 response. We know the shop owners, we know the residents, and we start learning what their challenges and crime impact is. As we grow the department back, and we have seen, particularly after the raises were instituted, we started seeing our numbers moving in the right direction toward our authorized force. We do have plans in place to increase the bike patrols, the foot patrols in communities, particularly those that are challenged by quality of life crime, narcotics crimes of that nature. So it's on our radar screen. We have plans in place to address the capacity issue as we grow the force back to its strength.
Thank you so much for that, and I appreciate you and all the work you've been doing and assisting. My next question is, I believe the use of excessive force a lot of times is contributed to the training protocols, and I remember I had this discussion with a few officers, just trying to understand kind of what their experience has been. And, a lot of times officers are trained to react a certain way in escalated situations. And I'm just curious what recommendations have come out of this use of excessive force task force, outlining any reforms to these specific training protocols or tactics that could sometimes result in an officer reacting based on how they're trained, and it leading to the loss of life or the use of excessive force?
Great question. So I'm answering it a few ways. I think the short answer to your question is the way that it's addressed is through changes in SOPs, and they didn't address it specifically through training, but I'll maybe speak to why. So one of the things, because we heard that very on with the advisory council, they say, hey, we believe training is an issue. We need more training. We need more training. And then so the team went and pulled training information and came back and reported a group, and what the findings were it's actually, it's probably not true that APD needs more training. Actually, when you look at APD, they're trained almost twice the state requirements and like 70% more than the national average. So APD has a lot of training, particularly when they're onboarded as they go through academy. Now the question is, how is the training? And that's probably where the focus should be, because it's not a question of quantity. And as we started to speak through that, a lot of the discussions were going towards, ultimately people are trained to execute, the operating procedures and all that. So a lot of focus was on operating procedures. The second piece that came up during training was, how much of the training that we do is Atlanta training. And I know that's something the police force has been trying to do more of, because the bottom line is there is a lot of training that is statewide or other jurisdictions that officers do. The bottom line there is, I think Atlanta has a different approach and philosophy to policing perhaps than others, right, in the way that we want our officers to conduct themselves. So one of the things that came out of discussion was we probably need to be focusing more on our internal training, and I know APD is working towards that. The last thing I'll just say, and as we think about that, is the mayor put out an administrative order to bring in external expertise that can help us with a top-to-bottom review of policing. And one of the core elements of that is looking at our training and getting that outside-in perspective of somebody who has experience elsewhere and can really help us think about what is best-in-class training as it pertains to that. So I know I walked around your question quite a bit, but specifically it's addressed in SOPs. It is not very, very directly. They don't have recommendations that relate to specific training classes. And it is something that the administration is aware of and has an order out around. And I don't know if Deputy Chief Shearbaum want to add anything on. Don't feel like you have to, but hopefully that answers most of your question, Council Member.
No, it does. And my last question is a really short one, and it's more so for Moki and APD as well as you, if you can answer this because it's already been touched on. PAD, I think in order for PAD to be effective in the city, Councilmember Faroki and I worked on legislation to expand PAD, which passed and was extremely successful. And I know that Moki's been working diligently to get this off the ground and really be able to offer PAD in areas that it hasn't been offered before. But we need a non-emergency response number for residents to be able to call without relying on officers to take the initiative to call PAD. Because I remember I did some research on it when I first came onto council about a year and a half ago. And, a lot of officers weren't familiar with PAD. And I also, after having conversations with, different stakeholders, I was informed that a lot of officers, because they weren't familiar with PAD, they weren't calling on PAD to assist them, and then PAD was only available in certain districts. So now that we're expanding PAD, is it in the recommendations to establish a non-emergency response number similar to 311, but specifically for PAD, to empower residents with the ability to call in without relying on an officer to call in?
So this is Moki again. I'm happy to add my 2 cents on that. So I think you're absolutely right, Councilmember Brown, that part of the work for officers to actually make the diversion referral to PAD, they need to be fully versed in how to do it, that we're available, et cetera. I think we have a strong partner in APD right now. Thank you to Deputy Chief Shearbaum and to Deputy Chief Murphy that are working closely with us to figure out the appropriate rollout strategy to the other zones, which will include a lot of officer engagement and training about how to access PAD. So I think we are on our way with that. We are working also closely with Commissioner Graham over the 311 system, as well as Director Pritchett with 911, to talk about how people are able to access PAD for non-police community referrals. I think it's critical that that residents of the city are continuing to use the public numbers in order to access services, and that we are one of providers. There could be multiple providers to provide these types of services. So I think working through 311 as the established non-emergency city services line, makes a lot of sense, and we're making, I think, really good progress with Commissioner Graham on getting that done. We have been fairly secretive about the number that officers use to contact us because we think it's important that there's a dedicated police line. So I think we could do some, we could make some changes around making sure that people have the officers have an easier time accessing us if that's a concern. But I do think having a dedicated police referral line like we have now is appropriate, and I'm really, really excited about working with 311.
Thank you so much for that, Moki, and thank you for all the incredible work you've been doing. And to Deputy Chief Shearbaum and Joseph, thank you for just allowing me to ask these questions. Madam Chair, I'll yield back to my colleague.
Thank you. Before we go on to a lineup of people with questions, I just want to recognize Councilmember Boone has joined us, Mr. Faruqi, unfortunately, was not. He just wants to apologize for not being able to be here today. I also want to recognize Samuel Reed with the Atlanta Citizens Review Board. He's also on the call if anybody has questions for him later. So let me go ahead with the lineup. We have Ms. Overstreet next, then we have Matt Westmoreland, and then we have Mr. Dickens. Thank you. Ms. Overstreet.
Thank you, Chair Shepard. I will say that a couple of my questions have already been asked and answered. Thank you for the presentation today, Mr. Zagabi and Moki. I just want to thank you, too, because you really have been a huge partner in trying to figure this out, even before COVID. I mean, I remember when I first got on council and we started that pilot program with pre-arrest diversion, how responsive you were and how jealous I was that it wasn't in Zone 4, and now we're here. And so all of this is taking time, and unfortunately, we're at a time in life where we really don't have we don't have the leniency to sit back and hope that things fall into place. We actually have to lean in and make it happen. So my main concern is with the community partnership right now, where, I'm on page 6, numbers 18 through 26 of the presentation, and it's pretty much what we've all been speaking about, especially number 19, where we're developing a plan to enable alternative first responders for situations where other expertise is beneficial and or police presence is not critical. You spoke earlier when Councilmember Bond asked you a question, and Moki, you said that you thought that whatever we start off with, and tell me if I heard you wrong, whatever we start off with should definitely go through the 911 first, and then maybe programming of something else later on. I will agree with that because we've been programmed universally that 911 is what you call period. And I do know that 911 APD will not satisfy every single situation. I totally understand that. I just know that even the most remote of citizens, and those are the people where the digital divide are, especially in Southwest Atlanta, where they don't have Wi-Fi and they don't even have email addresses, they're not going to get the message quick enough that we're not calling 911. So we have to do a concerted campaign to make sure that we are reaching the most remote and the most unconnected of our citizens, because these quality of life issues make a huge difference in the safety of us all, of us all around Atlanta. So, Moki, if you could speak a little bit more about that, about the fact that we are now going to be citywide, what that looks like, how we can transition from a 911, but how important it is to actually start towards expanding a campaign of knowing that, the PAD campaign.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. I appreciate that that comment and question. So, just in terms of the expansion for diversion services, I'm glad to have the opportunity to speak on that briefly. We are working closely with APD, as I mentioned, to figure out our expansion plan, and what we've actually commissioned of 3 years of call data, so 911 call data that was then getting matched with incident reports. And to what Jacob said earlier, it's about 1 million calls a year. So we have a data set now of 3 million that will give us, I think, a very good historical reference point of where potential calls are that could be diverted, and or potential calls that could be at some point diverted or recruited over to alternative responders. So I think that we're really trying to be data driven with this in where we expand into next. So we're in zones 5 and 6 now. and we really will be getting that data back at the end of September. And we'll be working closely with APD to figure out, based on APD's capacity, pads, and this data set, as well as hopefully conversations with all of you about how we phase in expanding zone by zone. So I'm excited about that. I think we'll be able to do that in a really strategic way. The other piece around the 911 call system, I do want to clarify. I think what we are working on with 311 is the non-emergency calls. And I think that, there's a good distinction there in terms of, if somebody we are in neighborhood meetings all the time, and I'm sure, and I know all of you are as well, where people say, there's an issue I'm concerned about, but it's not an emergency, and I don't want to call the police for this issue. And so, is there another number to call? And we've heard a lot of frustration around that. The 311 option, I think, could be that, right? What I'm very sensitive to, and I've had a really good conversation, several, with Director Pritchett over 911, is the potential for confusion around, when to call, and the potential of people calling 311 when there is an emergency and it really needs to be routed to 911. So we're working through those issues of just ensuring that, if somebody calls and needs to actually be connected to 911, 311 is already equipped to do that, and they do. So I want to make that distinction. But ultimately, I do think for emergency-related calls, I think it is unwise to say, well, if there's a mental health emergency or if there's this kind of emergency, call a different number. I think it makes a lot of sense, and I've learned this from leadership at APD, that, you have a really wonderful infrastructure at 911 with 24/7 dispatch, all of that. You don't want to recreate that wheel, but that it's the work, I think, ahead of us is building out what other teams can be dispatched and what the decision tree is for dispatchers, as well as training for dispatchers to do that. So I'm really hopeful that that's a conversation that the city will push forward. And I would suggest that Behavioral Health Link, which is the agency that runs the Georgia Crisis Access Line here in the metro Atlanta area, that they be involved in those conversations, as well as Fulton County Department of Behavioral Health, because I think that it's a broader issue that a lot of people are honing in on, and we actually have a great provider that just doesn't have the capacity to respond as quickly as they could, and it's a resource issue. So I'd leave it at that.
Okay, and I agree, and thank you for that answer. My next question is about just expounding a little more about that training, because we, as a council, did visit the Atlanta Police Academy, and I remember those numbers that you spoke of today, and I was quite impressed about the amount of training that we do with our police officers above and beyond what is required by the state. And I'm not sure, but I really think that we said that we spend at least $90,000 per recruit for training. Is that correct? Is anyone on that could verify that number?
Councilwoman, this is the Deputy Sheriff. I believe you're very correct. When I was the training director, it was right at $88,000, so I commend you for your memory. So counting in inflation, you're probably right in the ballpark.
Yeah, so to me, the bad actors that are on APD, I will say it does seem these days that it's really not 100% about the training as much as it is personal failures, especially what we've seen in the news lately. I know we aren't training people to pull shirts and shoot them in the back 7 times. Like, that's just not what's going on. So I think that I appreciate this use of force advisory council. I appreciate the presentations that you all are given today. I think that we just really need to stay this course, keep this use of force at the top of mind, continue with our pre-arrest diversion expansion, as well as all of the other issues that we have to tackle. There's not going to be one thing that we're going to do as a city that's going to make it all work and go away or fixed overnight. We just have to keep doing this good work. And thank you all for today. And I think that's all. I'll yield the rest of my time. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Overstreet. Next, we have Mr. Westmoreland.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the presentation team. I've got a few questions, and I'm going to bounce to the larger report, Jacob and team, for a couple of them. But kind of first off, on slide 3 for today's slide, and then it was slide 10 in the larger deck. Can you talk a little in 3 and 4 about the expert interviews that were conducted, and then the national best practices? Who did you talk to, both in Atlanta and then around the country? And then what cities or police departments stuck out in your mind as full of best practices that helped inform this report?
Absolutely. So I can speak to quite a few, and I'm going to say them from the top of my head, so I'm sure I will miss some as we work through it. But locally, we try to speak quite a bit locally to just folks who had different perspectives. So, you know, trying to speak to, you know, folks who were in the activist community. I mean, for example, Moki was not on the advisory council. That was somebody who we wanted to bring in because of her deep level of expertise. You know, Lee Reed, who's also on the line, not part of the advisory council, both of them sat in the working group meetings to help us just understand the local context, understand the nuance that, you know, obviously these are community members, so helping them just get up to speed. Then we spoke to several other folks from purpose-built communities and different groups that were local to just get a perspective and a little bit of history. As we started to talk to best practices nationally, a few things. One, and this is actually, it is very important, and, you know, we don't talk that much about it, but under the Obama administration, they looked at 21st century departments, and they named 15 model cities, and Atlanta was one of them. So one of the things that was actually encouraging or surprising when we reached out to other departments is they were saying, hey, we look at Atlanta and those other departments who are recognized as the leaders. So I don't think that we talked to a department where we were like, they are doing what we need to be doing wholesale. However, a number of departments had things that were really compelling. So we looked at Seattle and Chicago. They had really, really good use of force dashboards to have better transparency, to help people understand the trends, understand where use of force is occurring, who it's occurring with in the community, all of that. When we looked at use of force policies, the de-escalation policy that's in place, use of force continuum in Camden, New Jersey is one that came up a lot, as well as Chicago, in looking at that. When we looked at diversion models, we actually looked at Eugene, Oregon, which is not very large, but they had a group called Cahoots that's been around for a very long time, who's doing, you know, first responder models, as well as there were a couple other cities that aren't coming to mind right now. And then obviously we had some discussions with cities that have made big announcements. So the LAs, the Berkeleys of the world, who have made big announcements recently, as well as DC, around what they're trying to change, although in talking to them, they hadn't figured it out. So there were good discussions as to why, but they didn't really have the how.
Okay. On the larger deck, slide 11 talks about the recommendations that came out in the initial 14-day report, and 2 of them that are listed as being reviewed by the administration. One is about conducting additional screenings, both mental health and implicit bias assessments, and then there's one about requiring a more exhaustive background check during the recruitment process. I was wondering if you could touch briefly on each of those and kind of where that review is in terms of those joining the list of recommendations that have been adopted and are moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. So those 2 specifically are definitely still of interest. There has not been a quote-unquote decision to do them quite yet, and it's not because, and I don't want to speak on behalf of the administration here, but I don't think that it's because there's not an interest in doing them. I think we want to make sure that we bring the right expertise when we do them. So as we're working to bring on that external expertise, it's going to help us look at a top-to-bottom review of policing. I think the idea is that we want to include this to be able to bring in perspectives of what other people are doing. Like specifically when you think about background checks, there's a lot of breakdowns in the communication between various departments, and there's lots of, I've just heard anecdotes of how officers can leave a department despite maybe being in the middle of an investigation and it not be recorded. So we just want to make sure that we bring in the expertise so we don't put something together that isn't best in class. But I think there's a high intention to continue to look at these and move them forward. We just want to make sure we have the resourcing here that can help us do it the right way.
Okay. One of the things that I thought was really interesting in slide 26, 27, 28, kind of on into the report, there's some kind of polling or surveying that was done, about 600 folks in the community and then 240 or so people within the department. Who were they? How were they chosen? And then kind of how did that data help inform the conversations that the advisory council had?
Absolutely. So as this was ongoing, we worked with our partner at BCG, and they were able to get a survey going. And the reason was, you know, in the climate and everything going on, we wanted to get feedback, but we didn't want to do it. It was, here's the link, and people self-selected to do it. So actually, they worked with a third party to put it out there and get a representative sample. And the way they looked at representative was based on demographics, so age, race, as well as distribution geographically, so looking across the zone. And the idea is, like, let's just get a pulse check of how people are thinking. So are there things that we're not realizing around alignment? So, for example, on page, let me find a good one here. On page, on page 29, and there was a question around when different groups are interacting with APD, are they all treated equally? And we wanted to get a representative group from the community as well as from the police force to understand, do we look at it the same, right? And what you find is, no, the police force very much believes that they treat all people equally, and the community very much believes, or not very much, there's a big group of the community that believes very differently. And so the whole idea of the survey was just to understand some of the disconnects between the community and the force, and it wasn't to create a huge survey base that, you know, we could get everything from the community, but just to get a good sample set that was representative to start to understand some of these insights.
And do we know, like, who those 600 folks from the community were? Do we have deeper insight in terms of male, female, race, maybe different part of the city?
Oh, yeah, we definitely do. It's not here in the report, but we definitely have a breakdown of the demographics of everybody that took the survey.
Okay. A couple more. On page 46, it talks about the options to resolve some misalignment between APD and ACRB. Can you walk us / members of the public who are listening through, at whatever 1,000-foot level you want to, kind of the way the process works right now and the way that the advisory council thinks it could best work in the future?
Great question. So just, and sorry, I've been speaking fast, but right now I'm on page 46 of the report that came out. So not the presentation that we just went through, but the actual report that was published. And the way that, as we were speaking through it in the small group, we wanted to talk about what could be done differently and how things are done. So rather than talking about every little bit, we wanted to create a few archetypes in the spectrum. So on the left side of the spectrum, you have where we're at today. And by the way, where we're at today is, you know, our Citizen Review Board is one of the top ones in the nation. It's one that people look at as a model. But even with that, there are ways that we can look at perhaps changing it and strengthening it. So the spectrum we spoke about was where we're at today, where, you know, if ACRB has a recommendation, it goes to the chief. But often it's OPS's recommendation that ends up being the outcome. The chief makes the decision, but we call it more of an OPS-led process. A step to kind of shift the power dynamics a little bit is you know, when there is a disagreement, that it comes to council as an update, right? So rather than saying, you know, this happens and there's not very much light on it, it's just let's increase the transparency so that we're aware and that people are aware, council's aware when they occur. Another level beyond that would be to say, whenever there's a disagreement, either party can request that a third party review it, and that third party would make a recommendation to the police chief based on review of both different cases and what they believe to be the correct outcome. And the way we framed it is that's a third party that is selected by both ACRB and APD. So it's not it's that way you have an impartial group that has been selected by both. The fourth level that we spoke about is ACRB makes the final decision, and that decision goes to the police chief for implementation. And then the next level is that a decision is made either by ACRB or a third party, and that decision is binding, which, obviously is the furthest one. And the reason it's the most absolute is because the way our charter is written, the police chief has decision-making authority over personnel, so it would require a charter change, a code change and some other things. But that's just a way of thinking about the spectrum and just steps that we could take to think about the balance between OPS and ACRB.
Okay. And then
Mr. Westmoreland, we do have Mr. Reed from ACRB online if you want to address that to him, or I don't know if he has a comment to that.
Sure. No, that'd be great if he has any thoughts either on that slide specifically or anything that we've discussed.
Mr. Reed, are you there?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yes, this is Lee Reed with the Atlanta Citizen Review Board. My comments related to the proposal about the third-party resolution review. I think it's a great idea. It's going to be able to move us in the right direction that we are seeking to go. Because one of the challenges that we always had is trying to correct the disagreement rate between the citizens and the officers. So I believe this is exactly the way we want to go as far as our initial steps to bring closer alignment.
Okay, that's great. I appreciate your support of that. And then my last question, Mr. Zagabe, is about recommendations 25 and 26. I know that Councilmember Overstreet touched on the community partnership column as being one that's of particular interest to a lot of us, myself included. I was wondering, we've touched a lot on kind of 18 and 19, which haven't yet fully been addressed, and I was wondering if you could drop to the bottom of the column and elaborate a little bit about 25 and 26.
Absolutely. So this came out of the group, and this specific subgroup was chaired by one of the co-chairs, Tiffany Robert. And the idea being that as we think about the community partnerships that we have great partners, but there may be things that the partners that we have aren't equipped to work on, or there may be like very niche problems that Atlanta has that we might want to have more specialized people responding to. Well, in a landscape where there are organizations that provide that, they may be very small, or there may be no organization. And one of the ways that we could help support that, and this was the thought of the group, was to stand up a fund that would be, administered outside of APD, but would award grants or funding to organizations that could provide non-LEO response. That way to, one, help them with their budget and their capacity to do so, but two, formally connect them to the city in some way to provide that service. And just the thought of it is that this is something that we want to continue to grow, and we believe that there are certain areas that PAD can't cover or that we want other types of partners at. Let's say we very specifically want like a child services group that we can work with that we don't feel like we have the capacity from the county on. This would be a mechanism that would allow us to do so and fund organizations that do that and formally bring them into our, I guess you would call it, ecosystem of responders. And then the last one at the bottom, one of the things that came up, and we heard it from APD as well as Moki, is in some cases you have individuals where we're responding to quality of life crimes that are poverty related, and this is a big one, right? Like, this is actually a big recommendation. It's not easy, but we may not have the institutions in place to provide the midterm to long-term care And I know Pat has done a lot of work to help with that, but for an officer, when they may be responding, you can hear stories from officers where they respond to somebody who may be experiencing homelessness, and, they may take them to Grady, or they may take them to the jail because there was a violation. And the next day, the same exact thing may be occurring, right? If we had a more longer-term solution, whether it be to address homelessness or substance abuse or mental health challenges, it would help. And one of the ideas that my understanding that has been discussed prior is to have a crisis response center. That would probably need to be a partnership between the city and Fulton. And it sounds like this isn't the first time that's been brought up, but that's what the recommendation was about.
Okay, good deal. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Westmoreland. Next, we have Mr. Dickens.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Mr. Zagami and Shearbaum and all those that were on the advisory council. Actually, a lot of my questions were asked by the council members, many of them ahead of me. So I'll ask just a few more. Were all recommendations that were made by the committee, the council, were they all included in this final, or was there a vote taken within the committee to get the final set of recommendations, or how do you capture those things that were considered but not finalized?
Great question. So one of the things that we did early on, realizing that everybody came to the council from a very different place, was we took a survey at the beginning and got what we called a catalog of initiatives. So all the ideas that the entire advisory council had, and we took those and we tried to boil them down to the 14-day recommendations which came out. And then coming out of that, we determined that we wanted to go very deep rather than very wide. So to answer your question very directly, there were definitely ideas that came up that did not make the report, in large part because, this is just a very broad space, and it would be very difficult to bring every single recommendation together. However, we did have a list of all the recommendations that came in. And then secondly, as the groups went into their working groups, I think what you see here are, within that working group, what were the consensus recommendations. So specific to these 5 areas, to my knowledge, at least in my working group that I was a part of, and I sat through definitely 2 of them in total, there were no recommendations that were discussed that didn't make it per se, but there were things that came up very early on. I'll give an example. There was one that somebody wanted to have a residency requirement for all officers within APD. And it was discussed early on, and a lot of the discussion said there are some real legal challenges with a requirement like that, so it didn't end up making the 14-day recommendation. So we do have other recommendations that didn't, but within the focus areas, I think we've largely gotten them all. Hope that answers the question.
Yes, and so I guess following up on that, the final set of recommendations, the documents that we're seeing here, is a sign off by all members of the committee. There's no vote or yay, nay, abstention taken. Is it an assumption that everyone is in agreement, or I'm just trying to make sure that when I come out of this and I go talk to the sometimes task force, you come back and people are like, well, I didn't agree with everything. And we have this whole, social, political, disagreement based on recommendations. I'm not saying that has happened in this administration or anything like that. I'm just talking about how I wanted to know if there's a vote or something that was taken.
Absolutely. So there was no vote taken. Every group didn't vote on what was in, what was out. It was more of discussions, getting to consensus building, and then every time before any report came out or before anything was done, they were sent to the group and say, hey, anything you'd like to add. So definitely a chance to chime in and make changes, but there was not a formal vote of adoption or like that from every member of the council.
Okay. And then going to I think some of the questions that have been asked by other council members and often asked by the public is about, 911, 311, unarmed responses to various types of nonviolent crime or nonviolent offenses. And I think there's a sheet that you have, I think on page 61, there were some alternative, potential for alternative co-responder response if triage revamped. Essentially, this was, I think 2 or 3 council members have asked about this. I'm going to the next step from that, which it seems as though because it's a recommendation and it's in line with what a lot of us are thinking, and I agree with this recommendation and actually proud that y'all came to this decision. How did y'all, I know y'all just laid out the recommendation, but do you have a kind of a vision into timeline and possible pathways to getting a alternate co-responder? Is it strictly Moki's group pre-arrest diversion, which we just increased funding for and I've been supportive of from the start, or is it additional family counselors and other mental clinicians? Have you guys looked further down there, or are you setting up a separate task force subcommittee group to put in their deeper thoughts on that?
Absolutely. And Moki, please feel free to pile on. I know you were sitting in the group, so if I characterize anything a little differently, please feel free. I would say that out of all the groups, there were portions of it that needed definitely more work to figure it out. And at first, I'll be candid, we started working, and you see it in the report, can we start categorizing the 911 calls that could be diverted? And I think very quickly the group realized that this is not an easy exercise. And, as people were playing devil's advocate to various calls, we quickly realized, this is something that takes a lot of expertise and will take work, and will actually take process changes in how we take 911 calls for certain categories and all of that. And I think in the way that Moki speaks to it is, it's not about what somebody's calling for, it's about what they're seeing, and it needs to be a little bit more holistic. So I say that to say, this is going to be one of those areas that does need more work. I think the recommendation takes a first stab at saying, this is something that we could see and the group would like to see. Here is a way of thinking about it, and we've spent time thinking about it and pushing it forward to get to an outcome around a recommendation, but it definitely would still need more work and still need more talking to LA and Eugene, as well as working with our legal team to make sure that, whatever we come out with, we're deploying and people who are equipped to deal with the situations they're in front of. But Moki, I don't know if there's anything you pile on, or if you feel like that captures a lot of the discussion that we had.
No, I think that's it. I really appreciate the ask, though, Councilmember Dickens, because I think that's a huge piece of work ahead of us, and I hope that council and the administration can convene additional planning conversations about that and bring in the county and others.
Yeah, that's good. I'm glad that I wouldn't want to tell everybody we've got that one solved. That's a recommendation. It means that the group, the council, the advisory council, all thought it wise to start down a process of evaluating, different dispatching, options. And this is something that I think you're going to need a lot of community conversation about, because it is just on this page, it's 95 different call types. And, one neighbor might say, disorderly children, is this, how old are they? You start getting into the nuances of people, fire alarm or, silent alarm, audible alarms. I see some of them that you guys tried to kind of think through, and then I can definitely see where somebody said, we want to pull back off of this because this is going to sidetrack us trying to determine this right away. So I guess I'm interested in who and how fast will we get to work on these? The how fast is like, let's start assembling this right away. We're not done just because you guys have made these recommendations, right? We're appreciative of them and thank Mayor Bottoms and all of you for your hard work and leadership on this. But then now, this one is so delicate that you really have to start working on it now and put the right people in the room. So, I mean, I guess this is more of an encouragement to not take a victory lap on this one until you actually assemble the real thing, which is, you know, it may even be a phased approach, Moki. It may be like, hey, we're going to start this, and we're gonna go with, 10, call types, or 10, potential offenses that we will reassign. And we're going to try this in this way, and we're going to pull them into PAD, or we're going to pull them into PAD and some other government agency, a cross agency, like a Fulton County, something like that. And then we'll see how that goes for 6 months. But I just think, framing this one is very important for the immediate, because this is one that I heard a lot about during the whole set of protests and all of the conversations across the nation. So clue us in on that when you guys start working toward that right away. And that's it for me. The others were asked before. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Dickens. So unless someone else has something, I'm going to just jump in for a moment. What Mr. Dickens what he talked about just now was something that I was going to ask Jacob. When we look at page 5, and it has the blue dot by it, number 1, it says convene a working group that will be responsible for the reimagining of the vision, mission, and core values of the APD. Now, are we defining that working group as advisory council, or is this a new working group that you're talking about?
Absolutely. So, great question on the advisory council. So the advisory council was created for this 45-day period to come up with this report. So the work of the advisory council, at least for this report, is complete. They're not.
So who is the working group? And that's my. I'm going to go there. Just who is in the working group? Because I don't know anything about a working group.
Yep. So the working group has not been created yet. So the mayor, as part of one of the administrative orders, this is part of a scope of work that would be evaluated when specifically because the new working group, you're probably going to want to do that in tandem with a lot of community engagement, right? There's no group of people who are going to represent the community perfectly. So the idea being that group has not been formed. It would likely be formed when we begin a broader community engagement effort so that they can engage and work through that. And that's the recommendation, right? So there are different ways it can be done, but that's what the group recommended.
So there's a lot of work, as Mr. Dickens says. This is just the culmination of an advisory council actually submitting this, and it's a huge amount of recommendations that I think is great for us to work toward goals. I mean, this is not the work itself. So we still have a huge amount of work to do based on this 84-page document. And I've been going through it and marking, striking, and putting check marks on things. But as I go through it, one of the things I want to ask is how do we approach this? Now, I know at one point the mayor also, and it's in this report, talked about a consulting group coming in. Has that consulting group got involved with this document at this point?
They have not, to my knowledge, and I don't know if Jerome would want to add anything else. I believe that they're working to have that group finalized. I'm not sure where it's at. I haven't been directly a part of bringing them on. But yeah, the hope is that they will be on soon, and this would be one of the documents that they are definitely referencing and helping, and it also will help drive the scope of that group.
Exactly, and that was what I was told. This consulting group would actually begin to take this document and work for a huge amount of the work in here. It's very important for me and the council to know, number one is the compass of the working group. I mean, I would like to make some recommendations myself. I know there's other folks who've been calling me in reference to saying that they want to do things. I know Dave Wilkerson from the Police Foundation has called me and talked to me several times about where we are at this point. I think he's seen the report and read the report, and some folks are ready to go in terms of just, folks entrepreneurs who want to donate to some of the causes. But I want us to take the time. For me, it's not just about that. It's also about really taking the time to go through the SOPs, the visions, the community engagement is important. Just doing a whole assessment of everything in this report and making sure it's something that we all can wrap our hands around as the council and the mayor's office and everyone and the community, and begin to really give good input. So this is just the beginning. This report is just a boilerplate for us to begin with, and to move forward along with the police department and just completely reimagining this. So I will be getting back if y'all ask me more questions, unless you can tell me what you see as the steps at this point in terms of us moving forward. Do you have an idea or clue at this point as to how we're going to move forward with this document?
So I'd say twofold. One, we are moving forward already. So, the mayor issued administrative orders. So, as I mentioned before, APD has a number of orders. We've been meeting on a weekly basis, looking at how we get a dashboard out to the public that can show use of force over time. Talking through potential training. I was on a call with Moki as well as Deputy Chief Murphy. So for the items that were part of administrative orders, we are working to implement, and there's a timeline, and we're working to execute some of those. For the ones that there's not an administrative order against, I think we will. We got to take this one bite at a time, and make sure that we have the capacity to move it forward. So I just said that to say, we can definitely provide updates as these milestones are hit, but we can't, we got to do it piece by piece, as it is a lot of report, a lot of recommendations, and a lot of work.
It's a lot. It really is a lot. And so, and you're right, you have been doing things, and so maybe I should just switch how I ask that. And I just want to make sure that there's a process in terms of reporting this to the council, and also we getting our input on it. So we can talk further about this in terms of the process and procedures. This is a document that's very intense, and it's a lot to take on. And so I just want us as a council and everybody else to know what the next steps are. I just have questions about that. It's great, again, as you said, that you're already doing things internally. But how do other folks hear what you're doing internally, or when will the report come out based on these recommendations so that we can weigh in on it too? So those are the kind of questions that I have. And then when will the community become engaged in terms of this process, and how we as a council, because when we talk about community engagement, I see ourselves as a council members as boots on the ground, and we can really actively get some engagement going too in the community. Someone asked earlier about how did you do the survey and how did you get the information from the 600 people, but if you all as a council let us know as a council, we can also maybe do some things to approach this, and also council members can bring back information also. So, but I commend the report. I think it's very thorough. But again, like I said, it's just the beginning for us, and I just want to make sure that we can make sure we're being very inclusive.
Absolutely.
All right?
Absolutely.
Are there any questions for any of my other colleagues? Everybody is quiet. Well, we did good. It's not quite at 2 hours. Thank you, Jacob, Moki, Mr. Reed, all my colleagues who are on staff, everyone, thank you for the work session, and we will keep everybody up to date on what's going on next. Thank you.
Good job, everyone.
Bye-bye.